The cage smelled like something had died in it recently, and I suspected that something had been the previous occupant. The light was wrong, too blue, too cold, pressing in from every direction at once like the air itself had been replaced with something thinner. My wrists were bound behind me with a material I had never felt before, smooth and warm and absolutely unyielding no matter how I shifted my weight or adjusted my grip. I had been trying for what felt like 6 hours. It had not loosened by a single millimeter. My name is Cale Morrow. I was a demolition specialist in the British Army for 11 years. I have been blown up, shot at, buried under rubble in 2 different countries, and once survived a night in the Helmand Desert, with nothing but a broken radio and half a protein bar. I say this not to impress anyone. I say it because the moment I opened my eyes in the cage, I did not panic, I assessed. The cage was circular, about 4 meters across. The bars were not bars in the traditional sense. They were columns of that same blue light, close enough together that a human hand could not pass between them. Above me, the ceiling was at least 30 meters up, open to what I could only describe as sky, except the sky was the wrong color, a deep amber streaked with something like green cloud cover, and the light coming through it was not sunlight. It was something older and stranger. The sound reached me before anything else made sense. A roar, not of one creature, of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. A wall of noise that vibrated in my chest and made my back teeth hum. It came from all directions, rolling in from somewhere beyond the walls of the chamber I was being held in. I could feel it more than hear it. The ground itself was trembling slightly, as if the building around me had been designed to amplify that sound and channel it inward. I stood up. My legs were stiff. My left knee ached. It had been aching since a bad landing in Wales 3 years ago and had never fully stopped. I breathed slowly and took stock of everything I could see, everything I could feel, everything I could smell. There were other cages. I could see them now, spaced at intervals around a wide central chamber. Most were empty. One 20 meters to my left held something large and gray and coiled into itself like it was sleeping. Another, further right, held a creature I could not identify, upright, 4-armed, amber-skinned, sitting very still with its eyes closed. I did not call out to them. I watched. 2 figures entered the chamber from a corridor I had not noticed. They were humanoid in shape but not human in any detail that mattered, taller by at least half a meter. Their skin was the color of old slate, covered in overlapping scales so fine they looked almost smooth from a distance. They wore uniforms, black, fitted, with markings along the collar I could not read. They moved with the casual efficiency of people doing a job they had done 1,000 times. They did not look at me. One of them activated something on a panel near the wall. The blue light of my cage flickered briefly, and then a section of it parted, not swinging like a door, just dissolving from the center outward, leaving a gap just wide enough to walk through. The second figure moved to the gap and gestured toward it. The gesture was unmistakable across any language barrier. Move. I moved. The corridor they led me through was long and curved upward at a gentle angle, and the roar grew louder with every step. I could feel it in my feet now, vibrating up through the floor. There were other sounds beneath the roar, a deep rhythmic percussion, something like music but structured differently, built on intervals I did not recognize. My escort said nothing. I said nothing. I watched everything. The corridor ended at a pair of enormous doors, and the doors opened outward, and then there was no more corridor and no more ceiling and no more contained space. There was only the arena. It was the size of a city block, floored in packed red earth that had been stained darker in patches from what I preferred not to think about. The walls rose on every side in curved tiers, and every tier was packed. Thousands of creatures, tens of thousands more, all different, all loud. The sound hit me like a physical thing when the doors opened, a wave of noise so complete that I felt my hearing dull slightly just to cope with it. The air smelled of heat and something acidic and something else I had no name for. Above the highest tier, there were suspended platforms, floating structures that I instinctively catalogued as viewing boxes, the kind reserved for whoever ran this place. One of them was larger than the others and positioned at the exact center of the arena's arc. It was draped in dark fabric and partially screened from view, but I could see shapes moving behind the screen. Important shapes, I guessed. The kind that made decisions. A voice filled the arena. It came from everywhere at once, amplified to a degree that felt impossible, speaking in a language I did not understand. The crowd responded. Whatever was said made them louder. Then a translation panel activated somewhere near the doors I had come through. A small speaker mounted at head height, clicking and buzzing for a moment before resolving into something close to English. Presenting Specimen Acquisition 774. Classification. Class F. Species Designation. Human Origin World. Third Orbital Body. Unremarkable Yellow Star System Outer Quadrant. Threat Rating. Minimal. Anticipated entertainment value, low. Duration of bout projected under 2 minutes. The crowd was not impressed. I could hear it in the shift of the noise. A flattening, a settling. The sound of 100,000 beings preparing to be underwhelmed. Some were already looking elsewhere. I looked at the arena floor. I measured the distance to the far wall. I noted the 2 entry points, the doors I had come through, and a second set larger, on the opposite side. I noted the texture of the ground, the way the packed earth would affect traction. I noted the position of the lighting above, bright even, no shadows to use. Then the opposite doors opened. The creature that came through them was called a Grellian. Though I did not know that name then, I learned it later from Chev, the 4-armed amber-skinned prisoner who would become the closest thing I had to a friend in that place. At the time, I simply saw 6 limbs, 2 used for locomotion and 4 used for combat, exoskeleton the color of raw copper, approximately twice my body mass, and moving with the kind of balanced confidence that came from never having lost a fight. The crowd came back to life immediately. They knew this creature, they cheered for it. I rolled my shoulders, cracked my neck. The binding on my wrists had been removed at some point in the corridor. I had barely noticed when, which told me how casually these people viewed me as a threat. They had not even bothered to leave the restraints on. That was their first mistake. The Grellian crossed the arena floor toward me at a pace that was not quite running but was faster than walking. It was sizing me up the way I was sizing it up. I watched its movement, watched the way it distributed its weight across those 6 limbs, the way the 4 upper limbs held slightly away from its body ready. I watched the 2 long antennae on its head. They were rotating slowly, sweeping the air, reading something about the environment, vibrations maybe, or air pressure, or chemical signals. I filed that away. It stopped about 3 meters from me. The crowd went quiet for just a moment, the held breath moment before something significant happens. The Grellian made a sound, low, clicking, rhythmic. I had no idea what it meant. It did not matter, it moved. 6 slim in motion created something faster than it looked. The 2 lower limbs pushed off the ground and the 4 upper ones spread wide. A net of reaching, grabbing, closing force. Most creatures, most things with an instinct for self-preservation, would have moved backward. Backward would have been wrong. Backward would have put me against the wall with nowhere to go. I moved forward and to the right, inside the arc of its grab, and drove my elbow hard into the joint where its second and third left limb connected to its body. Not a strike intended to hurt, a strike intended to compress the joint, to tell the nervous system in that limb that something had gone wrong. The Grellian's antenna swept sharply in my direction, and I saw the response, a tiny hesitation, a micro-freeze, as the creature's body processed the unexpected signal from that joint. 30 seconds. That was how long I spent doing nothing but moving, redirecting, and pressing on that joint every time it came within reach. The crowd did not know what to make of it. They had gone quiet in a confused way, not an impressed way. The Grellian was getting frustrated. Frustrated creatures make mistakes. At 40 seconds, it overcommitted on a forward drive, all 6 limbs pushing in the same direction at once, trying to end things with pure mass. I dropped low, let the bulk pass over me, and locked both my arms around the joint I had been targeting. Then I pulled down and twisted. The joint gave. Not completely. Not in a way that ended the fight immediately, but in a way that sent a signal through the Grellian's entire nervous system that something structural had failed. Its balance shifted. Its 2 left lower limbs buckled slightly, compensating. And in that moment of compensation, its full weight came down on its right side. Its posture opened, and I was already moving. 88 seconds after the doors had opened, the Grellian was face down on the red earth with my knee on its neck, and both its upper limbs locked at an angle that made further movement both painful and pointless. It did not struggle. Something in its biology, some deep instinct, read the position it was in and accepted the conclusion. I looked up. The arena was silent, not politely silent, not the silence of a pause. The silence of 100,000 creatures all arriving at the same unexpected destination at the same moment and not yet knowing how to react. It stretched and stretched. 5 seconds. 10. The creature beneath my knee breathed in short, controlled pulls. I breathed normally. I looked at the large viewing box above the highest tier. The shapes behind the screen had gone very still. I did not smile. I did not raise my arms. I did not perform for the crowd. I simply looked at that box and waited, because in my experience, silence this complete always meant one thing. Someone important was about to make a decision, and it was better to make them come to you than to fill the quiet yourself. Somewhere above me, in a language I did not yet understand, a being who had never once considered that a Class F specimen might be interesting began to reconsider. Everything. I kept waiting. The crowd found its voice again, slowly in fragments, a sound here, a sound there, and then all at once, An eruption that was different from before. Not the comfortable roar of expected entertainment. Something rawer. Something that had no name yet because no one in that arena had needed a word for it before. I filed that away too. The next morning, or what passed for morning in a place with no windows and artificial light that shifted color on a cycle I had not yet decoded, a guard came to my cage and left a container of food without making eye contact. That was new. The previous delivery had involved being watched while a different guard stood, with what I assumed was a weapon pointed at me. Now the guard set the container down, slid it under the gap in the light barrier, and walked away quickly. I sat with that for a while. The food was edible. I had no idea what it was. Some kind of dense gray-green block that tasted of nothing in particular but sat heavily in the stomach in a way that suggested it was nutritionally complete. I had eaten worse. I ate everything they gave me, every time, because hunger was a form of weakness and weakness was a luxury I could not afford. The arena had not released me after the fight. I had not expected it to. I had been guided back to my cage by the SIM-2 escorts and the cage had sealed behind me, and that was that. But something had changed in the hours that followed. It was subtle. The kind of change that only matters if you are paying attention. Which I was. Always. The other prisoners were looking at me differently. The gray-coiled creature in the cage to my left had uncurled itself completely. It was long, serpentine, with 4 small clawed arms near its head, and it had positioned itself so that it was facing my direction. Not aggressively. More the way a person positions themselves when they want to observe something, without making it obvious that they are observing. The 4-armed amber-skinned creature to my right had opened its eyes. It sat cross-legged and watched me with an expression I could not read. Its 4 arms were folded into itself in a way that looked deliberate, a posture, not a resting position. After about an hour it made a sound. Short, soft, a single syllable that the translation panel, which was apparently always running, though I had not realized it until now, rendered as approximately interesting. I looked at it, it looked at me. "You speak something I can translate?" I asked. The panel processed this, clicked, and presumably pushed my words into something the creature could understand. There was a long pause. "I speak 17 languages," it said. Through the panel. "Yours is now my 18th. The panel is filling in what it does not know, which is considerable. Forgive inaccuracies." "Understood," I said. "What do they call you?" "Chev," it said. "Talindri. Diplomatic class, formerly." "You are the human, Kale," I said. "What's a diplomatic class prisoner doing in an arena?" Sheev was quiet for a moment. "The same thing a Class F specimen is doing, winning fights against mid-tier Grellian veterans. Being somewhere no one expected." That was the beginning. Over the following days, and I counted them carefully, scratching a small mark into the floor near the back wall of my cage every time the light cycle completed, I learned things. Shiv was extraordinarily well informed for someone in a cage, which I eventually concluded was because he had been here long enough to build a network of information that flowed through the arena's staff, its other prisoners, and apparently some communications channel I did not fully understand, and decided not to ask about too directly. He told me about the Vreth Dominion. He told me about the arena system. He told me about the classification that had been assigned to humanity, and I found I was not surprised by any of it. The Dominion had been running these arenas for roughly 3 centuries. They had encountered hundreds of species. Most species, when captured and forced to fight, performed in predictable ways. They fought hard for a while, then declined in performance as their psychological state deteriorated, and then they either adapted to the system or they did not. The classification system was built on historical data from those encounters. Class F meant low aggression, low threat, low utility. Something you threw in for variety when the crowd needed a break from the serious bouts. Humanity had been discovered 8 months ago, as near as I could calculate. A scout ship, Vreth design, automated, had picked up our radio signals and traced them back to Earth. They had not made contact. They had simply watched for a while, identified humans as probable Class F based on our apparent physical dimensions relative to other known species, and eventually dispatched a collection team. I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A remote training site in the Outer Hebrides, about as far from any population center as it was possible to be in Britain. The collection had been fast and silent. I doubted anyone knew what had happened to me. That thought sat in my chest like a stone. I acknowledged it and moved past it. There was nothing useful in dwelling on it. Sheev also told me about the fights to come. "They will not treat yesterday as a single result," he said. 2 days after we had first spoken, they will test it, they will send more, and they will escalate faster than usual, because there is money involved now. The betting shifted significantly after your fight with the Grellian. How significantly? You were listed at odds so high the number was essentially a joke. You are no longer listed at a joke. You are listed at something people are taking seriously. Which means the people who set the odds are frightened, and frightened people do unpredictable things. What do they send next? I asked. A Dorax pack hunter, Chev said. Probably within the next 3 days. I had him describe it. I asked questions for 2 hours. I asked about its vision, its hearing, its gait, its attack patterns, its weaknesses. Sheev answered everything he knew, which was more than I had expected. He had clearly done this before, gathering information about arena fighters, though he would not say why until much later. When I ran out of questions about the Dorax, I started asking about the species after that, and the species after that. Sheev watched me with his forearms folded and his expression unreadable. At the end of the second hour, he said, "You are not preparing to survive the next fight." "No," I said, "you are preparing for all of them." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. The last being who thought this far ahead in this arena was a Kessian strategist who lasted 14 fights before. Something changed in its biology that its people do not discuss publicly. That was 60 years ago. It is still the record. "Good to have a target," I said. The Dorax fight came on the 4th day. The Dorax was a pack hunter, which meant its instincts were calibrated for group activity, for coordinating with others of its kind, for circling, for cutting off escape routes. It was fast and it had exceptional low-light vision, and its primary attack was a forward lunge that committed its full body weight in a single direction. Against a prey animal that ran, this was devastatingly effective. I did not run. I moved laterally, constantly, never in a straight line, never far enough away to trigger the full commitment lunge, always close enough that the Dorax's instincts kept signaling that the prey was within reach. A pack hunter without a pack is a creature working against its own programming. I let its instincts exhaust it. Then I ended the fight. The crowd was louder than the first time. The Kessian war drone came 6 days after that. This one was different, mechanical in the way it thought, precise in the way it moved, built to execute a predetermined set of combat protocols rather than to respond to a living situation. I spent the first 90 seconds doing nothing but making it repeat the same sequence. By the 4th repetition, I had mapped the sequence completely. Then I stepped outside it, and the drone had no protocol for that, and it locked, just briefly, half a second at most, but half a second was enough. After the Kessian fight, I came back to my cage with 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated left shoulder that I reset myself against the cage wall before anyone could come to observe me, and a gash along my right side that bled steadily for about an hour before it clotted. I sat on the floor and breathed through the pain, and catalogued every lesson the fight had taught me. That was the night the guard brought me double rations without being instructed to, as far as I could tell. I did not acknowledge it. I ate everything. By the 8th day after my first fight, something else had changed. The serpentine creature to my left, which I had learned was called a Relini, and whose name was something unpronounced that Sheev had rendered phonetically as S, had begun leaving small objects near the shared wall of our cages, pebbles of red arena earth, placed in specific patterns that I eventually realized were not random. They were prime number sequences. I left an object in response, a thread from my sleeve coiled into a Fibonacci spiral. The next morning, S had left a pattern that incorporated both. We never spoke directly. The translation panel apparently did not cover whatever language S used. But mathematics, it turned out, needed no translation. On the 12th day, Chev told me about the Vreth champion. He told me carefully, in the way someone tells you something they believe you need to know, but are not sure you are ready to hear. He described it in clinical terms first. The biology, the combat history, the record. 340 bouts. 31 species represented in the category of defeated champion-class opponents. 0 losses in a career spanning what Chev estimated was something close to 40 Earth years. Its name is Vreth Prime, Chev said, which is both a name and a title. It is the supreme fighter of the Dominion's home species. It is also the symbol of everything the arena represents. An empire's proof of its own superiority. When, I asked, Sheev looked at me steadily. The centennial rite is announced once every 100 years. The announcement was made this morning while you were asleep. The date is set for 17 days from now. I sat with that. Why me? I asked. There must be higher-rated fighters here. There were, Chev said. Most of them are no longer here. The remaining high-rated fighters declined the selection, which they are permitted to do, at the cost of their arena status and considerable other consequences I will not describe in detail. He paused. You were selected because you cannot decline. You are still classified as Class F. A Class F specimen has no rights of refusal in the arena system. Convenient, I said. Yes, said Chev, very convenient for them. Potentially less convenient for Vreth Prime, depending on whether you intend to do what I suspect you intend to do. I looked at him. What do you think I intend to do? For the first time in 12 days of conversation, Chev smiled. It was a strange expression on his face. The geometry was different, the muscles moved differently than a human smile, but it was unmistakably the same thing. I think, he said, that you intend to win. Outside, somewhere in the amber-lit corridors of the Vreth Dominion's greatest arena, the staff were updating the betting systems. The odds on a Class F human specimen surviving 17 more days had just changed dramatically. Somewhere else, in offices and halls and communication relays across a dozen star systems, the name Kale Morrow was being spoken for the first time, by beings who had never known that Earth existed until 8 months ago. I went back to my corner of the cage and sat down and began, methodically, to plan. 17 days felt like a long time. It was not. In the first week, 2 more fights were scheduled, smaller bouts, ostensibly for the crowd's entertainment between major events. A scaled creature called a Morik that relied on thick natural armor and brute forward force, and a twin-bodied Lessian that thought in 2 independent cognitive streams and tried to execute 2 separate attack plans simultaneously. The Morik fight left me with a bruised forearm and a lesson about leverage. The Lessian fight was the most intellectually demanding thing I had done in the arena so far. Fighting a mind that was genuinely thinking 2 things at once required me to stop reacting to individual movements and start reading the system as a whole. I nearly lost. I walked away having learned more in 9 minutes than in any other single fight. S, through the stone pattern language we had developed, told me something interesting after the Lessian fight. It took 3 sessions to communicate the full idea, but eventually I understood. S had been watching every fight I had ever competed in from its cage, and it had noticed something about me that it wanted to confirm. The patterns it left were questions. Was I learning between fights? Yes. Was I deliberately changing my approach based on what I observed? Yes. Was I building a single unified understanding of all species combat systems rather than treating each fight as separate? Yes. The stones S left after I answered the 3rd question were arranged in a pattern that Chev, when I described it, translated as something close to. Good. You fight like water, not like stone. What does that mean? I asked. Shev considered. In Relini philosophy, which I know only partially, water is the superior force because it does not oppose the shape of what it encounters. It finds the gaps. Stone opposes everything and eventually breaks. He paused. I believe S is paying you a significant compliment. I looked at the cage to my left, where S was watching me with its many small eyes. I arranged 3 stones in the only pattern I knew how to express gratitude with in our developing shared language. S curled one small arm briefly in acknowledgement and went back to its coiled position. Sheev watched this exchange with an expression I had learned to read as contemplative. You realize, he said, that what you have built in the past 12 days is something this arena has not seen in a very long time. What's that? I asked. A community, he said quietly, not a hierarchy, not an alliance of mutual utility. An actual community built on respect across species lines. The guards have noticed. The administrative staff have noticed. The Supreme Keeper's office has noticed. I had learned about the Supreme Keeper from Chev's careful, measured his descriptions. The being who ran this arena, and through it, a significant portion of Dominion entertainment, and the political power that came with it. A being for whom this arena was not merely a business but an instrument of control. Proof of the Dominion's natural supremacy over the rest of the galaxy's inhabitants. A being who had reigned in this position for over 2 centuries and who was, by all accounts, extraordinarily good at reading the things that mattered and acting on them before they became problems. What does the Supreme Keeper's office do when it notices something? I asked. Sheev's forearms shifted. It watches. And then it decides what kind of problem it is. And what kind of problem am I? He looked at me carefully. That, he said, is what the next 17 days will determine. The 10th day brought a development I had not anticipated. A new prisoner arrived in the cage on the opposite side of the chamber. Not a fighter, as far as I could tell, but something administrative. It was Vreth, the home species, scaled and gray and tall. It wore a different kind of uniform. It did not acknowledge me, or anyone else in the chamber. It simply sat in its cage and appeared to be working on a device it had brought with it. Sheev watched it for an hour before saying anything. That is an observer, he said, from the Supreme Keeper's office. They send them to watch prisoners who are considered of interest. I looked at the observer without looking like I was looking. What do they report back? Everything. How you sit, how you eat, how you interact with others, whether you sleep normally, whether you show signs of psychological deterioration. He paused. They want to understand not as a fighter, as a being. Good, I said. Sheev tilted his head. Why good? Because if they are trying to understand me, that means they do not understand me yet. And that means I am still unpredictable. and unpredictable is the only advantage I have that cannot be taken away. The observer stayed for 4 days. On the second day, I caught it watching me and I looked back at it directly and held eye contact, or what passed for eye contact with a being whose visual organs were positioned differently, for a full minute, without expression, without aggression, without anything at all. Just looking, just being looked at. The observer eventually looked away first. I did not make anything of it outwardly, but inwardly I noted. It was the first time since I had arrived that something in this place had been the one to break contact first. The final fight before the Centennial Rite was announced on day 14, 3 days before the event itself. A Vreth champion. Not Vreth Prime, but one of the Dominion's recognized second-tier elite fighters. The announcement was made as part of what Shev described as a calibration exercise. They wanted to see how I performed against a Vreth fighter specifically. They wanted data on how my abilities translated against their own species before the rite. This told me several things. First, that they had stopped assuming the outcome. Second, that someone in the administration was doing genuine analysis, rather than simply assuming superiority. Third, and most important, that the fight against Vreth Prime had moved, in the minds of the people running this arena, from entertainment into something else. Something closer to a test. The Vreth champion fight lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Vreth fighters were faster than they looked, extremely strong, and had an exoskeletal layer beneath their scales that made many strikes less effective than they would have been against other species. They also communicated in combat through a system of microscale flickers, changes in the chromatophores beneath their scales, invisible to many species but apparently meaningful to each other. I could not read those signals, but I could watch for the moment just before the signal, the brief pause, the drawing in, and use it. It was not a perfect system. I took more impact in that fight than in any previous bout. But at the end of 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the outcome was the same. The arena was very loud. I walked back to my cage under my own power, which I had decided early on was something I would always do regardless of how I felt, because the walk was the last thing the crowd saw and I wanted the crowd's last image to always be the same. Unhurried, upright, and completely unimpressed with what had just happened. That night, Ch was quiet for a long time. Eventually he said, 3 days. 3 days. I agreed. 37 beings have faced Vreth Prime in the arena, he said. None survived. I want you to hear that not as a warning but as information. I understand the difference, I said. I know you do. He was quiet again. Then, the Talindri Compact has a saying. My people have used it for 600 years. I will attempt the translation as accurately as the panel allows. He spoke a phrase in his native language. The panel processed it. Then it rendered. Even the stone that seems immovable has moved before. It has simply not yet met the water with enough time. I looked at him. Sleep, he said. You will need it. I lay down in the corner of my cage and looked up at the amber light filtering through the ceiling, and I went through everything I knew about Vreth Prime. Everything Shev had told me. Everything I had observed in the Vreth champion fight 3 hours ago. Everything S had communicated through patient stone pattern conversations over the past 12 days. I built the fight in my mind the way I used to build a demolitions plan, systematically, contingency after contingency. Every variable mapped out as far as it could be mapped, and then the open space acknowledged honestly, rather than filled with false certainty. There was a great deal of open space. Vreth Prime was not something that could be fully planned for. I knew that. The plan was not to eliminate uncertainty. The plan was to be comfortable in it while Vreth Prime was not. I slept at some point. When I woke, the light had shifted. I ate my rations. I did my movement work in the small space of the cage. Not exercise in the usual sense. More calibration, keeping everything operational, keeping the body and the mind in communication with each other. I talked with Shev. I exchanged patterns with S. I thought about home, briefly, the way you allow yourself to think about something important without letting it consume the space you need for the present moment. Then it was one day. Then it was morning, or the closest thing to morning this place had. The guards came earlier than usual. There were more of them. They did not speak, but their manner was different, not the casual efficiency of the normal escort. Something tighter, more formal. One of them was wearing a different grade of uniform, with markings along the shoulder that I had not seen before. I stood up. I rolled my shoulders. I breathed. The doors to the corridor opened. The roar had already started, even before I reached them. It was the biggest sound I had ever heard in my life. A compound noise made of hundreds of thousands of individual sounds, layered and dense and alive, pressing through the walls and the floor and the air. Whatever this day meant to the beings in those stands, it meant something enormous. Centuries of tradition were folded into this noise. I walked. The corridor curved upward as it always did, and the noise grew with every step. and the light at the end of it was brighter today. More of it, richer in spectrum, as if someone had adjusted the arena lighting specifically for this occasion. I did not hurry. I did not slow down. I kept exactly the same pace I always kept, and I breathed exactly the same way I always breathed. Because the body carries the mind's decisions whether you instruct it to or not, and I wanted my body to carry the decision that today was the same as any other day. It was not the same as any other day. The doors opened. The arena hit me. Sound, light, smell, the slight tremble of the earth beneath the weight of that crowd, and I stepped through and onto the red earth floor and looked at the space around me with the same measured, unhurried attention I had given it on the first day. Across the arena, the opposite doors were still closed. Vreth Prime had not entered yet. I walked to the center of the floor. I stopped. I waited. Above me, the crowd's noise built and built, and somewhere above the highest tier, behind the darkened screen of the largest viewing box, something moved. I did not look up. I waited. The doors across from me began to open. I had spent 17 days building a picture of Vreth Prime in my mind. Every piece of information Shev could give me, and every observation I had been able to make secondhand. I had rehearsed the fight hundreds of times in my thoughts. I had mapped the variables, accepted the uncertainties, and prepared as completely as I was capable of preparing. None of that fully prepared me for the reality. Vreth Prime was large. I had known this. Sheev had given me measurements, roughly 2.5 meters at the shoulder, heavier than I had estimated. Exoskeletal layer fully developed to a depth that made many conventional impact points functionally useless. What the measurements had not conveyed was the quality of its movement. It moved the way very dangerous things move, without hurry, without wasted energy, with a settled, economical confidence that was entirely unlike the aggressive display posturing I had seen from every other fighter in this arena. It crossed half the arena floor before it stopped. It looked at me. I looked at it. The crowd went very quiet. Not the confused silence of my first fight, not the stunned silence after it, a specific, deliberate quiet that had been cultivated over centuries of centennial rite tradition. The held breath before something historic. Vreth Prime's chromatophores flickered briefly. I could not read the meaning, but I noted the pattern and stored it. It moved. The first 3 exchanges happened very fast. Vreth Prime's speed at close range was greater than the Vreth champion had been by a significant margin. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. I redirected rather than absorbed, kept my feet moving, used the space of the arena floor rather than trying to hold ground. I felt the edge of one strike along my left side and the impact compressed, something in my ribcage that sent a spike of pain sharp enough to temporarily narrow my vision. I breathed through it. I kept moving. By the end of the first minute, I had achieved exactly one thing. I had survived it. That was not nothing. 37 previous opponents had not survived the first minute. But surviving was not winning. And I knew the difference clearly. Vreth Prime paused. It looked at me again. That flicker of chromatophores, the same pattern as before. I cataloged it. Whatever it was communicating it again, which meant it was a response to a specific condition. What condition? I thought about it while we moved. Vreth Prime was applying force. I was not meeting force with force. I was redirecting. The flicker happened when the redirect occurred. Vreth Prime was communicating about the redirect, either to itself, a kind of cognitive labeling, or to the crowd a public commentary. Either way, it happened when its force went sideways. I tested this deliberately in the next 30 seconds. 2 more redirects, 2 more flickers, identical pattern. Then I changed my response. Instead of redirecting, I stopped a strike early, not absorbing it, but intercepting it at the origin, before the full force had committed. No redirect. No sideways transfer of energy. No flicker. Vreth Prime paused again, slightly longer this time. It did not know what to label what had just happened. The protocol it had been using, the one that had worked for 340 fights, had just encountered something it had no category for. I had not fought back. I had not run. I had not been hit. I had simply been present, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, doing something that was technically a different thing than what all 37 previous opponents had done. That half-second of unlabeled space was what I had been waiting for. I moved in rather than away, and for the next 4 minutes, I did nothing but fight inside Vreth Prime's ideal range, too close for its full arsenal to deploy, pressing on the joints where I had learned Vreth anatomy was least reinforced, making it work in the space it was least designed to work in. It adapted. It was extraordinarily good, the best opponent I had ever faced by a margin that was not close. It hit me twice in those 4 minutes with enough force to put a normal person on the ground. I went down once. I got up immediately, before it could capitalize, because I had planned for going down and I had planned for getting up. And the plan was to never stay down regardless. I lost track of the crowd. I lost track of the viewing box and the Supreme Keeper and the translation panel and everything except the fight and the floor and the being across from me and the mathematics of survival that I had been working on for 17 days and 6 fights before this moment. Then the joint I had been working on, the left secondary knee, a point Chev had identified as a structural limitation in Vreth Prime's late fight records, gave way just slightly. Not a failure, a micro-compromise, the kind that takes seconds to recover from. But seconds were enough. I cannot describe precisely what happened in the next 8 seconds. I was inside it, not watching it. I know what the result was. Vreth Prime was on the ground. I was on one knee beside it, one hand on its neck in the position the arena's own tradition recognized as a victor's claim. It was not hurt critically. It was not finished in any permanent way. It was simply in a position it had never been in before, with a being above it that had gotten there through methods no one in this arena had ever seen applied before, and the deep instinct that lived beneath all its centuries of training was telling it what its training could not deny. The position meant the fight was over. The crowd made no sound. I am not speaking loosely when I say that. 100,000 beings, representing dozens of species across tiers that stretched as high as I could see, made no sound at all. Not a murmur, not a shift, nothing. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own breathing and the small sound of Vreth Prime's breath against the packed earth of the floor. I looked up at the viewing box. The screen had been partially drawn back. A shape was visible behind it, tall gray, wearing something formal. I could not see its face clearly from this distance, but I could see that it had risen from its seat. A channel opened. The same everywhere at on sea voice that had introduced me as a Class F specimen with minimal entertainment value. But the words were different now. Speak your will, Victor. The translation panel rendered this in English a half-second later. Unnecessary by now. I had learned enough of the Dominion's common tongue to understand the phrase without help. But I let the panel do its work. Let everything be heard in every language. I looked down at Vreth Prime. I looked back up at the Supreme Keeper. The galaxy was watching through relay stations on a dozen worlds. 100 star systems had their receivers tuned to this arena at this moment. In the viewing box, the most powerful being in this corner of the universe was standing, waiting, with an expression I could not read from the floor of the arena, but could feel in the quality of the silence itself. I had thought about this moment. I had spent 17 days thinking about many things, and this was one of them. The question the Supreme Keeper had just asked was a ritual one. It had been asked at the end of every centennial rite for 3 centuries. It expected a ritual answer. There were 2 acceptable ritual answers, and both of them were about Vreth Prime's fate. Both of them kept the power of that decision in the hands of the victor and, by extension, reinforced the Dominion's control of everything the arena represented. But a question is a question, and a question, if you are willing to reverse it, becomes something entirely different. I looked up at the Supreme Keeper one more time. Then I asked in the Dominion's common tongue, clearly, at a volume the microphones would carry to every relay station on every listening world. Should I return it alive or shredded? The silence that followed was not the silence of the fight's end. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was the silence of a galaxy arriving, all at once, at the realization that the question had just been reversed, that the being on the floor of this arena, the being who had just spent 17 days in a cage after being classified as a Class F non-threat, had just asked the most powerful being in the sector to justify, to choose, to answer. It was the silence of 100,000 creatures, suddenly understanding that the thing in the arena was not performing for them. It was asking them to perform for it. I kept my hand on Vreth Prime's neck. I kept my eyes on the viewing box. I kept my breathing even and my expression still. And I waited in the complete and extraordinary silence of a galaxy that had just, for the first time in 3 centuries, been caught off guard by something it had thought was beneath its notice. The Supreme Keeper did not answer immediately. This was Chev told me later, much later, when we had the space and the safety to talk through everything that had happened. Unprecedented. The ritual question had always been answered within seconds, by every victor in every centennial rite in the 3-century history of the event. The answer was scripted by tradition. The victor was expected to make a show of deliberation and then deliver the expected words, and the crowd was expected to respond, and the event was expected to conclude with the Dominion symbolism intact and its message delivered cleanly. The strong decide. The rest endure the deciding. What happened instead was 32 seconds of silence. I know this because later, when the arena's recordings were reviewed and circulated, and they were circulated to every relay station, to every subscribing world, to every corner of the Dominion that had been watching, someone counted 32 seconds. In an event that had been running with the precision of a ceremony for 3 centuries, 32 seconds of the most powerful amazing in the sector, standing in his viewing box with nothing to say, was the kind of thing that did not disappear from a galaxy's memory. I stood Vreth Prime up. I did it carefully. Not because I was afraid of it. At that moment, with the fight concluded and the position established, I was not afraid of it, but because doing it carefully mattered. The way you stand something up tells everyone watching whether you are being generous or whether you are making a point. I wanted to be making a point. I wanted every being in that arena and every being watching through a relay station to understand that I had made a choice, and that the choice was deliberate, and that the choice was not mercy in the sense of weakness, but mercy in the sense of a decision made from a position of complete authority. Vreth Prime stood. It looked at me. Its chromatophores flickered, a pattern I had never seen before, not in any of the fights, not in any of the observations. I did not know what it meant, but it held still and it looked at me, and it did not move aggressively, and that told me what I needed to know. Then the crowd found its voice. The sound that came from those tears was unlike anything I had heard before in that arena, and I had heard a great deal. It was not the comfortable celebration of an expected outcome. It was not the stunned murmur of something surprising. It was something larger and older and harder to name. The sound of many beings responding to something that had touched a feeling they had, perhaps, not accessed in a very long time. The sound of something that, for lack of a better translation, felt like recognition. I did not raise my arms. I did not turn to the crowd. I simply walked back toward the doors I had entered through, at the same pace I always kept, upright and unhurried, and the sound of the crowd followed me all the way to the corridor. The guards who met me at the corridor entrance were different from the usual escort. There were more of them, and they wore the formal grade of uniform with the shoulder markings. They did not touch me. They walked beside me, not behind, which was new, and they kept a distance that was respectful rather than supervisory. Something had changed. The change was large, and I did not yet fully understand the shape of it, but I could feel its edges. I came back to my cage. S was already arranged facing me, small arms tucked close, watching with every available eye. I sat down in my usual corner. I felt the ribs that had been hit, the bruising along my left arm, the deep ache in my knee from a bad step in the 4th minute of the fight. I acknowledged each of these things and categorized them as manageable. Then I looked at Shev. Shiv was very still. His forearms were folded into his characteristic contemplative posture. He watched me for a long time without speaking. The light cycle shifted slightly, the artificial amber dimming toward its rest phase. "You know what you've done," he said. It was not a question. "I know what I've started," I said. "I don't know yet what I've done." He was quiet for another moment. Then, slowly, he reached into the folds of his clothing. And I was surprised, because I had not known he had anything in those folds. And he withdrew something, small and flat and dark, about the size of a credit card. He held it up briefly, then slid it under the gap of the light barrier. It came to rest on my side. I picked it up. "That," he said, "was hidden in a ration brick. It was sent to me 18 days ago by my government, when you won your second fight. They have been watching. The Talindri Compact has been watching since the beginning." I turned the device over in my hands. It was inactive, no visible controls. "Press the left edge," Shev said. "Not now. When you are alone and the observation cycle is in its off period. Approximately 3 hours from now." "What does it do?" I asked. "It calls someone who wants to talk to you," he said. "Someone who represents a great many beings who have been looking for a reason to have a conversation that the Dominion would very much prefer not to happen." I held the device. I looked at Shev. I thought about all the questions I could ask right now, and decided that most of them could wait 3 hours. "You were never just a prisoner," I said. "No," he said simply. "I was a disgraced ambassador in a cage, waiting for the right moment and the right being to arrive. I waited a long time." He paused. "You were worth the wait." The light cycle continued its shift toward rest. In the arena above us, the staff were processing the events of the day, and managing what I could only imagine was a significant administrative and political crisis. On worlds I had never visited, beings I had never met were watching recordings of 32 seconds of silence, and a question reversed and drawing their own conclusions. 3 hours later, in the quietest part of the light cycle, I pressed the left edge of the device. A voice came through it, small, clear, speaking the Dominion's common tongue with an accent I had not heard before. "Human," the voice said. "My name is not important yet. What is important is this. You are no longer a prisoner, you are a negotiating position, and we are very interested in what you want." I looked at the ceiling. I thought about home. I thought about the arena floor and Vreth Prime's weight beneath my hand, and 32 seconds of the most powerful being in the sector, having nothing to say. "Then let's talk," I said. The morning after the centennial rite, the Supreme Keeper requested a private meeting. This was communicated through channels I had not known existed until Chev quietly explained them. A formal request, extended through the arena's administrative system, carrying the kind of language that was simultaneously a command and a courtesy. The language of someone who had thought carefully about the phrasing. I accepted. They came for me 3 hours later, not the usual gray uniformed escorts, but a single official in formal dress, accompanied by 2 others who stood back and said nothing, and were clearly there for reasons of appearance rather than necessity. The official introduced itself as a senior administrator of the Keeper's Council. It spoke carefully, choosing words with visible deliberation, and the translation panel rendered everything in clean, accurate English that told me the panel's learning algorithm had been given significant resources in the past 12 hours. The council chamber was the first truly new space I had been in since the arena. It was above the tiers, connected to the viewing boxes by a series of walkways that offered brief angled views of the arena floor below, now empty, the red earth raked clean, the tiers bare. I looked at it as we passed, and it looked smaller than it did when it was full of sound and light. 100,000 beings. Most things do. The room itself was not large. A table, chairs suited to the Vreth anatomy, which were uncomfortable but functional for a human willing to adjust. Pale light from above. The kind of deliberate simplicity that powerful people sometimes use to signal that they do not need the decoration of power to feel powerful. The Supreme Keeper was already there. I had seen it only from the arena floor at a distance through the partial screen of the viewing box. Up close, it was old in the way very old things are old. Not frail, but settled, compressed by time into something denser than it had once been. Its scales were paler than the younger Vreth I had seen. Its eyes, positioned slightly differently than a human's, angled outward and forward simultaneously, were very still and very attentive. It watched me sit down. I watched it sit down. There was a long pause that I suspected was deliberate. I have reviewed recordings of every encounter you have had in this facility, it said. The translation panel kept pace, steady and clear. From the moment of your arrival to this morning, every fight, every observed interaction, every exchange that our monitoring systems were able to record. It paused. I have also reviewed all available information about your species, which is limited, but less limited than it was 12 months ago. What did you learn? I asked. It considered this, that we made an error, it said, in our classification methodology, in our assumptions about what physical dimensions and apparent technological development indicate about a species' actual capacities. It paused again. I do not admit errors easily. I want you to understand that I am doing so now with full awareness of what it means. I nodded. I appreciate that. What I want to understand, it said, is whether the error is correctable. I looked at it steadily. Define correctable. There are 12 species currently held in this, and our affiliated facilities who are classified as Class F or below on similar grounds to your species. There are 8 worlds currently under Dominion exploration and extraction programs that may harbor species who have not yet been contacted, but who may warrant reclassification under revised criteria. It placed one hand on the table, a deliberate gesture, flat-palmed, which Chev had once described to me as a Vreth indicator of good faith. If I were to tell you that a revision was being considered, would that be relevant to a conversation about future arrangements? The word arrangements carried a great deal of weight in the way it was said. It would be a starting point, I said. The Supreme Keeper's eyes moved, a small sideways shift, a gesture I had not seen from any other Vreth. Something that looked, in its own geometry, like acknowledgement. You asked a question in the arena yesterday, it said. A question that has been transmitted to 1,100 receiving stations across 14 star systems. A question that has, in the past 24 hours, generated more incoming diplomatic inquiries to this facility than the past decade combined. It paused. I want to ask you something about that question. Go ahead, I said. Did you know, it said, what you were doing? I thought about how to answer this. Not because I did not know the answer. I knew it, but because the phrasing of the answer mattered. I knew what the question would do, I said. I didn't know exactly how far it would travel or how many people would hear it, but I knew what it meant to ask it. Yes. The Supreme Keeper was quiet for several seconds. You understand that what you did was not simply win a fight. You understand that you used the arena, my arena, the Dominion's arena, as a stage for something else entirely. I understand that the arena was already being used as a stage, I said. I just changed who was directing the performance. The silence that followed was shorter than the one in the arena yesterday, perhaps 10 seconds. But it had the same quality, the quality of something very large and very settled being asked to consider moving. I want to make a proposal, the Supreme Keeper said. I'm listening, I said. Your freedom, it said, complete and formal. Transportation to your homeworld, in a vessel of sufficient quality to make the journey without difficulty. Full diplomatic recognition of humanity as a Class A species, retroactive and with a formal apology communicated through the Dominion's standard channels. It paused, in exchange for a conversation. A continued conversation, not today but over time, between your species and mine, between humanity and the Dominion, through whatever channels you and your people decide are appropriate. And the 12 species currently held in your facilities, I asked. The hand on the table shifted slightly. That can be part of the conversation. It needs to be part of the agreement, I said, not the conversation. The agreement, another pause, longer. The Supreme Keeper looked at me with those very still, very attentive eyes, and I looked back, and I thought about 32 seconds in an arena, and a galaxy holding its breath, and a being who had not had to justify itself to anyone in over 2 centuries finding that it needed to now. 6 of the 12, it said finally, released within 30 days. The remaining 6 to be discussed within the first formal session between our governments. 8, I said. And the 8 released before I leave. 7, it said, and 7 released within 15 days of your departure. I thought about this. I thought about Chev and S, and the Relini stone pattern language, and the guard who had brought me extra rations, and the observer from the keeper's office who had looked away first. 7, I agreed, and Chev is among the 7. The Supreme Keeper's eyes shifted again, a longer sideways movement this time. Chev, it said, is complicated. I noticed, I said. He goes in the 7. The pause was the longest yet. Then, we sat in that room for another 3 hours, and I learned what it was like to negotiate with an empire on behalf of a species that did not yet know it was being negotiated for. It was not comfortable. It was not clean. There were things I agreed to that I was not certain I had the authority to agree to, and things I refused that the Supreme Keeper clearly considered trivial and that I considered anything but. But at the end of 3 hours, there was a draft formal, not binding yet, nothing that my government would need to ratify, but a shape, a starting point, a framework. Walking back to my cage, with the same formal escort and the same respectful distance, I felt something I had been carefully not allowing myself to feel since the moment I had woken up in the blue light of that cage. What felt like a year ago, I felt the weight of what came next. It was enormous. Sheev was awake when I returned. He looked at me and I looked at him and I said, "You're in the 7. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "What did you give for that?" "Less than they wanted," I said. "More than I wanted to." I paused. Many conversations. Between your people and mine and theirs and everyone else who decides to show up. Chev's forearms unfolded slowly. A gesture I had learned meant something close to profound relief, though he would probably not have named it that. S, in its cage to the left, arranged 3 stones into a pattern I recognized. The pattern 4. What happens now? I arranged 4 stones on my side. The pattern Chev had taught me that meant something new. S was still for a long moment. Then it coiled its small arms into a shape that both Chev and I had come to understand as its equivalent of a nod. 10 days later, a Vreth scout ship, not a collection vessel, a diplomatic vessel, a distinction that had required its own separate negotiation, was prepared and cleared. 7 prisoners walked out of the facility. Myself, Chev, S, and 4 others whose stories I knew in fragments and whose freedom felt like something that had been owed for a very long time. The Supreme Keeper did not come to see us off. A senior administrator did, and there was a brief ceremony I had not expected, and did not fully understand, but stood through with appropriate gravity. Then we boarded, and the doors closed and the vessel lifted. I went to the observation window. The planet fell away below us, Vreth Prime, the Dominion's home world, covered in its vast cities and its extraordinary atmosphere, and all its centuries of assumption about what the galaxy was and who deserved to sit at the top of it. I watched it until it was too small to make out clearly. Then I went to find Chev. He was in what passed for a common area on the vessel, sitting with S, who had managed to arrange a small collection of pebbles, apparently gathered from the arena floor before departure, which I had not noticed and which told me something important about S that I filed carefully away. The 2 of them were, as far as I could tell, talking through stone patterns, with Chev occasionally adding verbal commentary that the translation panel converted into something S could receive. Through vibration, I sat down with them. "How long to Earth?" I asked. 14 days at this vessel's optimal speed, Chev said. "I have been asked, through various channels, whether you would object to a brief stopover at the Talindri Compact's nearest relay station. My government would like to meet you in person before you reach your home world." "Of course they would," I said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," I said. "But they should know in advance. Anything they want to discuss will eventually go through proper channels with my government. I'm going to be very honest about what I am and what I can agree to and what I can't. They know, Chev said. That is in large part why they want to meet you. S placed a stone at the edge of its collection, a single white pebble, positioned apart from the others. I did not know this pattern. I looked at Chev. It is new, he said. It invented it today. As far as I can tell, it means beginning. I looked at the white pebble sitting alone on the floor of a diplomatic vessel moving through space that I had never expected to cross, on my way home from a place I had never expected to go, carrying the weight of a conversation between species that had not known each other existed, until very recently, and I thought about all the things that word carried. Beginning. The vessel hummed around us. Somewhere behind us, an empire was revising its classification system. Somewhere ahead of us, a planet was going about its day with no idea what was coming. Somewhere in the relay stations and the betting systems and the diplomatic channels of 14 star systems, 32 seconds of silence was being watched and rewound and discussed. I looked at the white pebble. Yes, I said, that's exactly right. The approach to Earth took the full 14 days, plus 3 additional days at the Tilindri relay station, which turned out to be less a station, and more a small world in its own right, with a surface and an atmosphere and a city that had been built over 6 centuries into something genuinely. The Tilindri were extraordinarily gracious hosts, and I spent those 3 days in conversations that were careful and honest and, in several moments, very difficult. They wanted to know about humanity, not our biology. They had the Dominion's data for that, such as it was. They wanted to know about our thinking, about how we made decisions, about what we considered important when everything was working against us. I told them about the arena, about the first fight and the calculation that had gone into it, about the knights in the cage working through variables, about Chev and S and the stone pattern language and the double rations. I told them about the Centennial Rite in as much honest detail as I could manage, including the parts where I had not been certain of the outcome and had proceeded anyway. The Tilindri representative who led most of these conversations was named Adira. She was small by her species standards, Shiv's height, which was shorter than average for Tilindri, with a quality of attention that reminded me of the best commanding officers I had worked under. Fully present, processing everything, never performing understanding but genuinely reaching for it. On the second day, she asked me, when you stood Vreth Prime up, when you chose what you chose, what were you thinking in that moment? I thought about how to answer honestly. I was thinking about the message, I said, not the words, the message. Because there were 2 ways to interpret what had just happened in that arena. One interpretation was, a human beat Vreth Prime. That's interesting, but it's just a fight result. Fights happen, results happen. The other interpretation was, the system that had run that arena for 3 centuries had just been shown to have a